Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, on justice. In Book 5, Aristotle turns to one of the specific virtues. So a virtuous person will have various virtues, like various colors of the spectrum of color. And one of these virtues is justice. Now, in books 3 to 4, which is chapter 7 to 12, in fact, Aristotle discussed the other virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, friendliness, etc. Book 5 is a specific discussion of justice. It is, in fact, a very influential and significant discussion, which has played a large part in the discussion of justice throughout history, both in philosophy and morality, ethics, and in politics. So what Aristotle points out is that of all the virtues, justice is most concerned with individual and society. I think this makes sense because when we think of the just and the unjust and fairness, we think of our relations with someone else and with our neighbor. And so for this reason, in fact, historically, well, this goes back to ancient thought, and we saw this in Plato's Republic. It was called another's good or another's benefit. And in Plato's Republic, this was seen because justice was thought to be only useful insofar as one can appear just. And remember, Thrasymachus says, well, then the unjust man will only be interested in justice for the sake of appearing just, and while appearing just, the unjust man will do unjust deeds, right? And so Aristotle will reject this view as Plato does, and he will suggest, no, justice actually benefits both one's neighbor and oneself. So he's kind of taking the position that Plato takes, that justice, and Socrates, that justice is something which is good in itself and good for its benefits, and it's beneficial both to ourselves and to our neighbor. Now, Aristotle will make a few divisions here, so you'll have to take care to pay attention. So the first division he makes is that justice as a virtue can be divided into a part and a whole, and in fact it can be divided into that virtue which is justice, and when we look at virtuous person itself, we can say, well, that person is virtuous, and notice how we say that person is good, and we can also say that person is just, because somehow justice plays a part in defining what virtue is itself. And for this reason he says that justice is complete virtue itself, so the virtuous person is the just person is the virtuous person, and that would be justice as a whole. At the same time, a just person, a virtuous person, can do just things, so that would be virtue as a part. Okay, so the idea here is that when you are virtuous, you possess justice and you possess virtue in the most complete sense. And why is this? Because if you recall, virtue is defined by Aristotle as a mean between extremes, the extremes being vice. So knowing how to apply the mean means that you know what parts should be rightly divided. And of course, to know which parts should be rightly divided is to know what's fair and unfair. And to know what's fair and unfair is to know what's just and unjust. And so the person who is able to divide between what's fair and unfair in terms of temperance, courage, wisdom, prudence, honesty, etc., knows how to spread out the parts equally and fairly, and so is naturally just in that way. And so in a sense, if you're not just, you actually are completely absent in virtue itself. And so justice is one of the most significant virtues from that perspective. Now, what he's going to suggest is that we'll have to actually investigate justice as a whole, which is complete virtue, and that part of virtue, which is justice. We'll be focusing on the second part. Justice as a whole will be really examined within the Politics book, which we will not be examining in this class. So let's look at it this way, and here's a kind of circle of virtue, right? And notice that in the circle, the parts of it are the different virtues, right? Notice that justice is a part as well. So we have the parts that are virtues, okay, and we have the whole of virtue. And when you have all the virtues, and when they're evenly set, then you have justice, because now you know what part goes to what part, and you know how to divide things fairly in all things, in prudence and temperance and courage, and so you are just as a whole. At the same time, the just person can enact just deeds. And they can also do unjust deeds, but that just follows because we're human and mortal and finite. So at the same time, this justice as a part we can enact. And so here we see then the distinction between justice as a whole, when all of the parts are brought together, and justice, which is that part, just another virtue. Okay? So, again, a further division. He says, let's look at the virtue of justice, right? And let's divide that, because it can be divided, because we have, for example, laws, and you can speak of just and unjust laws, but then you can talk about just things that are not laws, right? So we have justice in the sense of the lawful, which relates to the laws of the state, and justice in the sense of fairness, okay, which is justice as it relates to relations among individuals in society. Now, what he says is that all that is lawful, justly lawful, is fair, but not all that is fair is lawful. Okay, I think this kind of makes sense because we recognize that there are things that are not lawful, but there's still justice in relation to those things. Okay, here's an example. It's lawful and fair that private property should be protected. Okay, so we each have private property, and so it wouldn't be fair if my private property were protected, but it would, and somebody else's isn't, right? So that's lawful that it's lawful and just that we should protect property, and it's fair as well. But, and look at this, it is not necessarily fair that some people are rich, uber rich you could say, and others are not. So do you see that? So it's not necessarily fair, but it is lawful that still, and look at this, that we should protect their property, so we shouldn't steal from the rich for the sake of the poor. Okay, so this would be Robin. So in a sense, Robin Hood would be going against justice, and in fact, he would be going against fairness, right? Because justice in the sense of this fairness notion, because we shouldn't be stealing something that was actually legally gained according to the laws of the state. And you'll think of the Crito dialogue that, well, we chose to abide by the laws of the state, so because some people got rich legally on the basis of it, well, we don't have the right to steal from them. Okay, so you can make arguments there. So Aristotle goes on to examine justice in terms of fairness, and again, the politics will discuss the broader notion of justice as lawful, and we won't talk about that. So, a further subdivision. Fairness, okay, so let's look at it. We have justice as a whole and justice in part, okay, and then we can talk about justice itself as divided into things that are legal, right, legally binding, and things that are not, but has to do with fairness. And now if we look at, so we're not looking at laws, we're just going to look at things that have to, justice that has to do with fairness. And if we look at things that are divided into fairness, we can distinguish between distributive and rectificatory justice, all right? So just be careful to make those distinctions. So, distributive justice. Distributive justice is defined here or described as the equal and fair distribution of socially recognized goods. I should take note that when most people think of justice in terms of fairness, they think in this way. But Aristotle is very keen on making distinctions, recognizes that there's another type, which we'll turn to after this. So, fair distribution means fairly distributing wealth, income, opportunity, and so on. In other words, we should all have the opportunity to obtain the same things. It also includes burdens and debts. So, for example, we shouldn't have person A in the same town as person B, and person A has to serve on 50 jury duties, and person B only serves on 1. The same with taxes, right? If we're taxing one person and we're a certain number N, and we're taxing another person a certain number M, and M is ridiculously larger than N, well, it just doesn't seem fair, you see? So this has to do with fairness, and so we have to be careful because sometimes in our desire to protect people who might be poor or something, we can actually overstep justice by sort of looking at the rich and taking their wealth from them that they've gained legally and that they've gained through our laws, and stepping beyond the bounds of fairness. So these are questions that one has to ask when looking at these types of laws that are made. Okay, so now unfairness in this sense means that you have some sort of unequal distribution among persons that are otherwise equal, right, or organizations. Or you have an equal distribution among those that are unequal. And you might be saying, well, this is democracy, there should always be equal distribution, but actually that wouldn't actually fall in the confines of justice. So it wouldn't be just to have that type of distribution even in democracy, and indeed we recognize differences along this area, and I'll show you one in just a moment. So distributive justice is then proportional, And so you can think of it this way, that we have two persons and we have relations between things, and if the proportion is equal, then it's fair, and otherwise it's not. And so let's look at an example of how this could be the case. So take two individuals, Amy and John, and they work at some corporation X, and their salaries. Let's assume that the only thing in determining what's just or proportional in this case will be just their experience, okay? So experience alone determines salaries, right? And we can see whether their salaries, based upon this single determination, is just and fair. So we'll take A of X to be Amy's experience, A of Y to be Amy's salary, and B of X to be John's experience, B of Y to be John's salary. Now let's take a look here. We have that Amy has worked for 2 years and obtained $50,000, and that John has worked for 2 years and has obtained $50,000, and so this is just. Okay. Sorry, I should add to this, and I realize now that we're not going to do just salary, but we'll also do years of experience, which often makes sense in many jobs. Okay. So looking at the next one, we have 2 years of experience, and Amy's making $75,000, and we see that John has 2 years of experience and is making $50,000, and John can say, well, why is Amy getting this much and I'm getting only this much? And you see this is unjust. And similarly, we have Amy has 2 years of experience and is getting $50,000, and John has 3 years of experience and is getting $50,000. And again, it seems unjust because here John should be getting more money. Okay, so notice how these things work, and we have these notions of fairness just in our everyday life and workplace and salaries and experience, etc. So turning to the second type of justice as fairness, we have rectificatory justice. All right. So let's look at this. So this is that justice that seeks the fair balance in relations of gain and loss among individuals. So this is a little different because it's not about distribution. It's about things that can't be distributed in equal shares as in the previous case. So how would that apply? It would apply to relations such as assault, theft, rape, murder, and so on. Why? Because the perpetrator results in a net inequality in relation to the victim, right? If you assault someone, well, how do you now redistribute that unfairness, that imbalance, right? You can't just, what would you do? You can't just go back and assault the other person back, right? You see, this doesn't seem to resolve the inequality, to rectify the inequality. Of course, there's a sense of this in which historically there has been a kind of rectification in the sense of retribution. So retribution would be assaulting that person back. But we're going to see what Aristotle thinks about retribution toward the end of this, and we're going to show that, and he's going to show that, well, retribution doesn't really fit as a just response. Rectification is what's needed, not retribution. So we have this net inequality, and it needs to be rectified. And so Aristotle explains how to rectify it. And let's take a look here at this explanation. Let the line AB, which is this, be divided into two unequal parts at D. So there it is, A and D now, and D and B. So those are the two unequal parts, of which AD is greater. The man who has got AD has too much, so this would be the perpetrator who commits the assault, so they've gained too much in terms of justice. And the man who has been left with only BD is now the victim, right? So the judge, so they take the case before the judge, and the judge bisects it at the line C, and taking away from AD the amount by which it exceeds the half, namely CD, so takes this from the perpetrator and adds it to BD, gives this back, and then BD plus CD make up 1/2 the line, of which AC, etc. So victim is BD, lesser part, aggressor is AD. The rectification is you give this to the victim and you take that from the perpetrator. Now this is, of course, it's not the type of proportion we saw before. It's a rectification of an imbalance. And in the actual world, the judge will have to do this, right, not necessarily in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way. So the judge will have to then choose some sort of a punishment or a fine. Notice how the fine or the punishment would serve to rectify this disrelation in some way, okay? So the judge, and this is interesting historically, is in the Greek term what's called the bisector. And this is kind of, you bisect the line here at C. Because you have this one line, you have the the imbalance, and he bisects the line to create the balance. And so in ancient Greek, the word for judge is to dikeon. Dikeos also means just, is rooted in dicha, a division into equal parts. And so the judge was called odikastis, the bisector, as one who bisects, dichastis, the line correctly. And again, the chaos also means right or just. And so the just is to bisect equally and fairly. Right? And so this is the notion of rectification, is that there's an imbalance which is caused by an assault of some sort or stealing, and we need to rectify it. But it can't be rectified simply by distributing goods that now are not shared, right? Because how do you distribute a case of assault? Rather, you have to find some sort of way to rectify it, which is also fair, because there can be an unfair rectification. For example, if the judge gives too much to the victim and maybe punishes the perpetrator beyond the actual means of the crime. So for our last point, let's look at retributive justice or retribution. We ask, well, what's the difference between rectifying the crime, right, in the case of assault, and the retribution, retaliation, right? And what is the root of that in particular? And Aristotle has a very interesting theory. He says that this notion of retaliation is rooted actually in exchange, market exchange of goods, reciprocal exchanges. Why? Because a just exchange of goods implies a reciprocal exchange. For example, you exchange a quantity of food for shoes. Okay, so you're going to have to give a certain farmer, let's say, only has food to exchange maybe before money is created, and so has to give a certain amount and gets a pair of shoes for it. And likewise, the person who has shoes exchanges it for food. So now, of course, for this reason, money was introduced to serve as a valuation, and so we can use money instead of food to buy a house, for example. So his basic idea is that what happens is that those who say that justice is about retribution, they confuse this notion of reciprocal exchange with that of rectifying. So rather than rectifying the crime of assault by providing the proper punishment, they think, no, we need a reciprocal exchange just as we do with goods. And so a reciprocal exchange is demanded for all cases of injustice. And so notice the exchange here. If I cause you to lose an eye, right, if you have shoes, then I ought to give something for the shoes. And there's the exchange. If I cause you to lose an eye, then I ought to also. And this would be then retribution as distinguished from rectification.